Chance to read Hogan's book last week, correct? So yeah, I studied naval history, wanting to study naval history for a lot of years, but as I actually did on my program and started to get into my research, my professors started to kind of enlighten me. By the way, tell me if I need to talk up, by the way. My professors are basically trying to show me that I'm not really studying naval history as much as I'm studying rhetoric about naval history. I'm studying consumer culture. I'm studying masculinity. There's a lot of subjects that I'm studying that are just outside of naval history. Because naval history tends to be sometimes a little boring. It's this battle, this ship did that, this ship did that. But one of the things that I'm very preoccupied with, and the questions that I started asking as a historian, is what place did the Navy have in the United States and the people of the United States right around this time, 1880s, 1890s, when all social institutions in the United States are really starting to change and people's lives are starting to become involved with these institutions. So we're going to talk about, and forgive me if I have to hit my notes, this is a fairly new presentation, so I'm actually not that far ahead as you guys are. So we're going to talk about ways institutions changed a little bit, and perceptions of institutions by the people. We're going to talk briefly about concepts of masculinity, only in that if you guys read the Hogan's introduction, you want to put a face on what this American masculinity looks like. I got a guy for you, his name is George Dewey, and we'll take a look at him a little later on. I'm also going to talk about memory and rhetoric, okay? Kind of a new subject for me, which shouldn't be, since rhetoric is just trying to persuade people, persuasive speech. But and like Hogan's said, that these guys, these imperialists of the day, the politicians of the day, they took rhetoric seriously. So when they were talking about colonial efforts being a positive and being an evolution of society, they meant it. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how that rhetoric turns into memory, how you can kind of pre-plan what your historical, you can kind of pre-plan what your historical event will be and how it's remembered, especially if you're a historian. Okay, so you don't have to write these questions. As a matter of fact, I'd be more than happy to make this presentation available to you guys afterwards so you can kind of take a look at it. But these are some of the questions that I was asking myself. These are not for you guys. I mean, this is for you guys to take a look at, but these are the questions that I was looking at myself as I was trying to figure out more on the topic that I was going to be on, including, how is the Navy changing? They were a technological innovator as much as they were a military organization. And during this time period, from the 1880s, 1890s, they actually started to become more of a societal institution, teaching teaching hygiene and teaching manliness and honor. These words are kind of abstract to us, but to them it really wasn't. So again, it kind of asks the same question Hoganson does about the use of a prim and proper military man to kind of represent what America was supposed to look like and what America was all about. What does that say about us? What does that say about those who would use the images of the prim and proper military man to sell empire, basically? And basically what I was asking myself is that Navy was popular during this time period, but was it as popular as empire? Did the people support the idea of the United States going into foreign countries and occupying? At first I wasn't sure. I mean, that's one of those questions. We have to put a question in here. Does anybody in here kind of believe that America is an empire right now? Anybody? A couple. So that's one of the things that historians are grappling with quite a bit. And so what my research basically goes is that I kind of avoid that question because I go to a time period when there was no question that America was an empire. They wanted it. Guys like Theodore Roosevelt wrote about it. They used the word imperialism. Back then, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a bad word. I mean, I think the word propaganda has changed over the years. It used to mean information. Now I think it has a different connotation. I think empire has the same connotation. But if you look at what people read and what they purchased and what they liked, things that they gravitated towards, it's easy to see that the American people were behind many of these imperial efforts. So we're going to start with the navalists, and this is where I know you guys are waiting for all that great naval history, but you're just going to get a few pictures, say. But basically battleships and really steel hull warships were kind of the super weapons of the era. They were like the nuclear weapons of the era. If your country had a few of these things, you could pretty much push your way around the world. 19th and 20th centuries, there were several arms races that were actually limited by international treaties. But at this time, it was just basically, it was all about evolution of society. And basically, the countries of Europe were building these ships. This was kind of a test of the level of your technological sophistication, really the sophistication of your entire society was based on how many of these ships you could actually build. So growing out of this is a group of guys called the navalists. And Hoganson kind of refers to, you got the jingoism, people that support aggressive US policy. These guys are sort of jingoists, but really they are influencers of public policy. They can be naval officers, they can be politicians, they can be, really a lot of really influential ones came from the press and academia. There was a large group of navalists. When I say navalist, naval militarist is another, it's almost a made up word. Matter of fact, Dr. Prince, one of my mentors at the university, even in a paper circled it, and was like, what is this? You know, and this is a guy that's very well read. It's just not a subject that if you don't read naval history, you don't see it. So, naval militarist, can't really say imperialist because not all navalists were imperialists, but they still believed in the modernization and the implementation of a strong state navy. So these are the basics of a navalist. Strong states require strong navy. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. The new modern navy using steel, at this point they're even using electricity, is an example of their modern marvels. If you can build one of these things, it actually says quite a bit about your nation. They've advocated for massive spending on these ships. Here's where their jingoist policies come in. They do advocate for colonial projects, expanded trade, but the reason why isn't necessarily because they believe in it, but they understand that the more that they can achieve these kind of projects and get the Congress behind it, the more ships that they will be able to make. And that's what they want. They want as many ships as possible to be able to implement what navalists call a two-ocean navy. Basically, it's a worldwide navy. The leaders of this group of navalists at the officer level in the Navy is the naval aristocracy. A guy named Peter Kerstin wrote a book called Naval Aristocracy. Relatively boring, but at least it does kind of show how American elites, in the government, basically go to the same social clubs and hang out with the same people as the social elites in the military. Washington, New York, they're all part of the same group, and a lot of them do believe in naval building. Many politicians use it to run on as well. Grover Cleveland, who was pretty much known as one of the most anti-imperialist presidents we ever had, deflected on Hawaii, really kind of tried to keep America out of it. That guy liked to build ships and did help with the initial building of some of our ships. So I want to kind of side note real quick to talk about rhetoric. Anybody familiar with the term yellow journalism? Anybody? Yeah? Okay, so for those of you who don't, basically yellow journalism, it was an era that took place, let's say 1890s-ish. There was a newspaper battle between the New York Journal and the New York World. And its fight for subscribers basically rested on sensationalist headlines. So they would go out of their way to find every single headline that they could find about how horrible the Spanish were treating the Cubans and the Filipinos. And that became headline news. This is, and I hate to say it, this is fake news, okay? This is selected use of headlines to be able to steer someone in a specific direction, either one way or the other. And at this point, they wanted to drive towards war.
Because I just saw the Joseph thing. Is that who the Pulitzer Prize was named after?
Absolutely. So it's a little ironic because, as a matter of fact, Professor Holt and I were talking beforehand that the name Hearst always comes up as the kind of the guy that is behind yellow journalism, but it was a binary relationship between Hearst and Pulitzer, who, yes, is known for the award that is specifically given for ethics in journalism. A little bit of ironic moment there for history. So the question that a lot of historians ask is how much influence did the press have over American opinion about the Spanish? They really were vilifying the Spanish in every way possible. Hogan's book really talks about this. And A lot of historians dismiss yellow journalism as, but at the time, there was one particular gentleman out of Yale who argued that absolutely that the press going after these specific motifs of Spanish freedom fighters, the Cuban freedom fighters that America should be helping, was really powerful to Americans at this point. And also, marketing companies, this is a paradigm shift for them. They are now looking at being able to use this new kind of freedom fight as a way to be able to sell products. And again, how do you sell American empire? You're trying to sell it, or you're trying to appeal to something, a want or a compulsion that is already there in the public. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about navalists. This guy, Alfred Thayer McMahon, will come up if you decide to take history courses from here on out, especially on the graduate level. You're going to keep running into this guy. Not as a naval historian, but he is that, but as a rhetorist, as a guy that really basically was one of the first ones to articulate that American power had to be offensive in nature. So he's the co-founder of the Naval War College, so he kind of is very early on in this process, cultivating young minds. He is a member of this aristocracy. The interesting thing about him, that me and my major professor were kind of stunned that the guy wrote over 150 articles from 1880, early 1880s up to 1890 in some of the major magazines like McClure's and Harper's and Atlantic and in newspapers. And he would write about every subject you could imagine: civilization, civilizing machine, religion. As a matter of fact, he was also a board member on one of the Christian missionary missions. So this was a guy who was deciding where American aid was going as well. And he, in 1890, writes a book called The Influence of Sea Power on History, which is an allegory to Americans about the dominance of the British Empire through the use of the Royal Navy. It basically is telling America, this is what we need to do. We need to build ships. We need to use them. We need them in 2 oceans. And not only does this become foundational to American military tactics through the Second World War, this book is actually gobbled up by Europe. Queen Victoria is a big-time navalist in her own right, has the biggest navy in the world, the Royal Navy. Big fan of man, as was her cousin Wilhelm, who happens to be the Prussian emperor, the future German empire, basically. And so he read this book and got together with his I can't think of the gentleman's name right now, and basically decided that the way they were going to challenge England before World War I is to start building a German navy, which a lot of his naval historians, I will say, naval historians believe is the major cause of World War I, was England did not want Germany to have a navy at all. So this book and his influence actually ends up reaching out beyond, some could say in a negative way. So here's a navalist that you guys might know, Theodore Roosevelt. Wonderful rhetorician in his own, and that is not a made up word, guys. I just learned it 2 weeks ago. So, as a 23-year-old undergrad at Harvard, he writes The Naval War of 1812. And does this sound familiar? Allegory to the Americans that success against the British was only possible through the breaking of the blockades. There was no way during the War of 1812 that the U.S. had any kind of naval dominance, but they used its navy tactfully, strategically, to be able to eventually kind of work it to a stalemate, War of 1812. But what's interesting is that he becomes extremely successful because of this. Imagine being, you're all in your early 20s, you write a book, let's say you write a book, and all of a sudden it becomes the naval history book that everyone wants to read. Everyone, all of these, not just in the United States, but worldwide. He becomes very, very famous, and I think a lot of it is because he was connected as a well-to-do New York social elite. His whole family is that group. But he gets notoriety based on a history book, and then is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by William Kennedy. So for those of you who are going to get history, your mom and dad ask you, what are you going to do with that? Theodore Roosevelt. So this guy basically, you'll see how he becomes important. And him being a historian is actually very important to this narrative that I'm telling you guys about. So, and this probably should put this in the timeline you're about to see, but he deploys the Asiatic fleet. This is the fleet that will eventually be in the Battle of Manila Bay, which is the famous naval battle that starts the Spanish-American War. He sends this fleet over in January the year before. So they're there for a year before this actually happens. He actually even resigned, and I think the date is wrong. I think it might be later. So Manila Bay is this giant naval battle happens. I'm about to get into it, which kind of almost decides the war. Nothing in Cuba has happened yet. So as soon as this happens, and the war is over, the Battle of Manila Bay ends, Theodore Roosevelt resigns his commission as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and forms a volunteer military organization called the Rough Riders, which he takes and goes to Cuba. He ends up in Tampa first, New York City. So this guy, talk about manly man wanting to become, really express your masculinity and not be stuck in the office being Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Even though he completely orchestrates a naval battle that's about to take place, he wants to go fight in Cuba. So that's a little bit of Hogarth coming out right there for sure. So let me talk a little bit about the timeline. I think you had a timeline on the back of your worksheets as well that kind of have some of these items, but I just wanted to bring up a few moments in naval history that kind of correlate with what's going on in Cuba. So you've got the War of 1812 published, first government contract for ships in 1883 under the Naval War College. So I kind of skip about 6 years, but that's really because not that nothing is going on. It's just first it takes a lot of time and effort to build warships, as well as because you aren't going to be in a position to fight Spain unless you have the warships to back it up. So if you're going to fight an imperial power, let's say in 1888, and you need about 5 or 6 years to actually get your ships built and ready, you can see that it's nothing that you can just step right into. You guys familiar with the main explosion? Yeah. Okay, so main explosion happens, and of course we're led to believe that this is what ignites everything. I argue that this is happening in 1883, that preparing for a war that is going to happen down the road. Do they know it's Spain? Not necessarily, but they can kind of see that they're European power that is falling off and easy prey. And so one of the, you can see two of the dates in here is about Jose Marti. And basically, the reason why I put that in there is that, these events are going on and the newspapers are reporting on them like they're happening right now. So the New York newspapers are reporting what's going on in Tampa, and Marti is giving a speech. And they're doing it again to rile up the people, to get the people hating Spain, and really even more than hate is getting people to believe in something and go along with something. It's easy to get people to hate. It is harder to get them to believe in freedom fighters, believe in democracy. And so they really do pitch the Cuban revolutionaries as the kind of the next stage of the founding fathers, that this is what it looked like when we were rebelling against the British. So this timeline's a little bit more peculiar. You've got, spoiler alert, the guy at the top dies in the next class. Just saying. General Maceo, again, this is one of those moments that's a turning point in the Cuban Revolution where the notoriety, and these guys are starting to die. They're becoming martyrs, really, is what we're dying. So in September 1897, Parker Brothers releases a board game called War of Cuba. We'll get to that, but I just wanted to show you again some of the timeline here. That basically the fleet is over in Japan when the Maine goes up. So it's already in position to be fighting the Battle of Manila Bay before the Maine explodes. Now when the Maine explodes, look, there's zero arguing about what killed the Maine, okay? Spanish mines is what the newspapers said. And ash firing the boiler is what actually happened, which has been confirmed like 3 or 4 different times. But the narrative still keeps coming up like this, we do this, in Spanish. But what's kind of interesting about the Maine particularly is that it basically becomes the rallying cry for the entire war. And you're led to believe that, again, there's some people that even believe that could have been a false flag. Okay? somehow someone is, and they even talk about this on the USS Olympia tour in Philadelphia. Was this an ash fire? Was this sabotage to try to get the American colony? The bottom line is that these were very volatile ships. They exploded actually with frequency, strangely enough. And so, and my only proof in it, and the thing that kind of puts my kind of thoughts at rest, is I was reading an article by my hand where he's talking. He's talking about the Pacific in the United States' role in the Pacific. And so, like halfway through the article, strange thing, it stops, and then he's got this separate section that says, upon the writing of this article, the USS Maine accident had happened in Havana. And he warns in this article about rushing to judgment and going to war over what could be a boiler explosion. But about 2 weeks later, he's got articles that are just totally saying, this is a Spanish mine. This is Spain doing this to us. This wasn't an accident. So it's funny, this moment of clarity and honesty is there for like half a second. And it really kind of disappears with, again, historical narrative. You know, these navalists understand, they're writing history books, but they're also writing what they want to be U.S. policy going forward. In other words, they know what it means to be remembered. So, Battle of Naval Bay, won't get into it too much. I think this picture pretty much says it all. Complete and utter devastation for the Spanish fleet. They didn't have a chance. America knew they didn't have a chance. The rest of the world thought they had a chance because it was the Spanish Empire, Spanish Armada. They were famous for their hundreds and hundreds of years of fleet action, but today it wasn't going to happen. So you had 6 modern U.S. ships led by Olympia, which is only a cruiser. This is her right now. Get to go up and play around with this this coming summer again. If you ever get a chance to go to Philadelphia, I would suggest visiting this. Spanish were all obsolete, you know, steam ships, but they were all kind of Civil War era wooden, and they came apart very easily. Battle only lasted 6 hours, and it would have been less, but somebody miscounted ammunition on board Olympia, and Dewey decided, and we'll talk about Dewey here in a second, or Commodore at the time, he decided to break for lunch to count artillery shells. Very gentlemanly thing to break for lunch. You're killing your opponent. So once they came back in and realized they had plenty of shells, they basically used the rest of them. Spanish losses were pretty significant, 77 dead, over 270 wounded. They lost most of their fleet. Americans had one sailor die of heat stroke. Look, I know his parents were probably devastated. But just used to drink the water with the 9 sailors injured and 1 cruiser damaged from just surface attack. Again, these are artillery shells that were supposed to sink ships, and they're just basically ricocheting off the steel balls. Here's a few images. A famous painting that someone had made, done actually one-off, where each person wanted a big mural and had arts to it. Over there, anybody ever heard the phrase, "You may fire when ready, Gridley"? Ever heard that? So it's a famous naval saying, and it happens right here. This is what this depicts, the watercolor over here. Admiral Dewey standing up there with Gridley, his second in command here, and just before this that happens up here, he says a famous, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." So he's not even, and that just tells you a little bit about this honorable masculinity. He's not even really the one giving the order to fire. He's handing it off to his second in command, delegating to another gentleman, another naval aristocracy member. And so this is the poor little Vienna Christina, which used to be captained by Admiral Mantel. We'll talk about him at the very end of the presentation. So it's a total slaughter. War correspondents are actually on board the ships when this happens, and to them it's completely an unbelievable surprise. And they take that astonishment to the newspapers. Matter of fact, 2 of the ones that we're going to talk about, Joseph Stickney and John Barrett, are on board Olympia when this all goes down, and they not only write a biography about Dewey, including the battle, but also comes his life story as well. You can see here, there's the Chicago Tribune headlines, and then this is actually the name of one of the books, The Life and Glorious Deeds of Admiral Dewey. Basically, he becomes an overnight sensation. So he is a member of this aristocracy. He's also a member of New York and DC social club, so very connected guy. It's no accident that he's in Manila Bay when this happens. He is the right guy, the right place, at the right time, and there's nothing serendipitous about it. This was completely constructed. Him being there, being at the right place, at the right time, including a guy who's an able innovator. He was working in Washington before he went. And if I'm speeding through this a little bit from here on out, that's because I want to spend time with you guys. So here's what I was talking about. Manila Bay is an orchestrated moment in history. It's a seminal moment. So in other words, on April 30th, 1898, the United States is this. On May 2nd, 1898, America is this. It's a complete change. We unseat the Spanish Empire to kind of join the great powers of Europe. It's our first victory against a European power. First overseas colonial projects. And again, this whole thing was constructed by a historian who understands what historical narrative is and what it means to the future. So how you remember that moment. It's not just important on how you got there, it's how it will be remembered going forward. So he's worried about rhetoric that we are talking about right now. And of course, this is the very first use of Mahan's to Ocean Navy, proving Mahan completely correct. Well, he stayed one completely correct. So Dewey, I'm working on a project right now about Dewey. I call Dewey Media, Restoring American Masculinity from War, Media, and Consumer Culture. So he returns the hero admiral, and he's not even an admiral yet, and they're already calling him an admiral. As a matter of fact, in 1902, he will be receiving an admiralty, the first admiralty. No one ever holds that title ever again. He's the only one. So in a way, the government is kind of constructing their own narrative by giving him a title that doesn't even exist, that going forward, the future will have to refer to him back to him as the first of one of these. So even to a certain extent, the Navy Department is trying to construct a narrative. So I was talking about Barrett and Stickney. So this is something that Barrett had written a day after Manila Bay that ends up in the correspondence. History must therefore give Admiral Dewey one of the loftiest niches in the temple, where he will be looked up through all the ages. His name must rank with many respects with those of Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Lincoln, Grant, Farragut, and others who have had such an influence upon the history of this expanding republic. So here we have a war correspondent who is not just a reporter. He used to be the ambassador to Siam, which is modern day Thailand, for 4 years. He gives it up to go and travel with Dewey for the Spanish-American War, and this is what he's reporting back to his newspaper editors, and that's what they're printing. And nobody seems to blink at it at all. So this is kind of an interesting moment where Dewey has become Michael Jordan. Dewey has become the very first marketing kind of example. He's the first face of marketing in this country. There really isn't an individual that I can think of that you can say pull them out and use this particular persona. They used more abstract terms, but this is a guy that gets used for who he is and what he did. And this is a particularly kind of jarring ad for 1899 in a mainstream magazine, Pure Soap ad. And for those of you who can't read it, let me just kind of get into it a little bit here. The first step in lightening the white man's burden is to teach you the virtues of cleanliness. He also says that, let's see, at the bottom here, Pure Soap is a potent factor in the brightening of the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. While amongst the culture of all the nation it holds the highest place, it is the ideal toilet soap. So what's interesting is that you see here, you've got American war naval ships up here. You've got the colonial project down here of offloading a ship or onloading a ship of all Pure Soap. And then over here you have, the uncivilized that he is giving Pure Soap. That's what he's so thankful for. So even for 1899, this is a mainstream marketing tool. By the time that the companies are, that marketers and advertisers are using ideas like that, they think that the American people, this is what the American people gravitate to. I'm not going to put someone in there. I know a lot of times in advertisements, the strangest people end up in there. I think that's modern advertising, always trying to think outside of the box. At this point, they're trying to focus on the most popular tropes, the things that people will gravitate to, and make them buy more. So this ad kind of shows that. It also shows, anybody familiar with Rudyard Kipling and the White Man's Burden? Anybody? So just as a side note, if you take it upon yourselves to be good students and read something relatively interesting, Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden is quite interesting because you can't really tell how the guy comes down on imperialism. It seems like he's joking about some of the stuff, but a lot of people at the time used Kipling's words to support their argument for empire, when some people actually believe he's trying to warn the United States not to go into the Philippines. So this is where I get to the fun part of this. Hopefully I won't run out of time. I know what time it is. So from 1897 to 1900, Parker Brothers kind of decided that they were going to take advantage of this kind of rise, this rise in patriotism. And so they produced a game, War in Cuba, that basically asks boys ages 8 and over to choose sides in the Cuban Revolution. And so basically while their parents are learning about the Cuban Revolution from the newspapers, they're getting this board game that basically is showing them the binary kind of aspect of revolution and then asking them to take sides. And again, this is 1897 that this game was released. Kind of continues on after the Battle of Manila Bay with 2 games based on Admiral Dewey, where if you win 3 games, you were sent to the rank of admiral. How great is that as a 8-year-old? And so I'm kind of rushing through a little bit, but wanted to get to this final game. This was released in 1900. It's the last of the games that Parker Brothers released. It's on the Spanish-American War. It's a Philippine War, crushing the rebellion in Luzon. So what's interesting about this is that, so in just 3 years, you go from asking 8-year-old kids to defend Cuban revolutionaries, and defend the Cuban freedom fighters, and now you have them fighting against the Filipino insurrectionists. Chances are they're the same kids. So the way that empire, okay, the way that American intervention, the way that revolutionaries, the way that occupations are seen, are changing, even just from how these board games, how Parker Brothers, a name that we all know, changes. Now, don't get me wrong, you want to read a great book? There's a great book on Parker Brothers that talks about risk and its involvement in the Cold War and Soviet Union. It's fascinating. It started early. But you can see on this too, look at these images. You got guerrilla warfare. It's showing guerrilla warfare in 1900, which they really didn't talk about that often. They're shooting in all directions instead of being lined up like you would normally see armies like here. You also see some colonial project stuff going on here with unloading of ships, and then showing American, let's say masculinity, but certainly superiority with the artillery there. So yeah, we talked about this a little bit, but yeah, it does kind of, these games kind of reflect the changing notions of American civilizing mission, societal progress, imperialism, and again, these are 8-year-old kids that are learning this. Consumer goods. So this is another item that kind of leads me to believe like, was the Navy popular? Was empire popular? Did the people kind of get behind these efforts? And I believe they did because of the amount of goods that were created. Consumer goods are being created, all the factories in all the big cities, all kinds of items from combs, silverware sets, plates, you name it. And Dewey, his flagship, the Olympia and the Maine, started to become tropes to be able to sell things. So in short, basically Dewey Mania kind of ran wild. And here's a couple of items from the archive. On the right top left there, you've got Dewey on top of, this is a serving dish. You got the Dewey axe. Who doesn't have a Dewey axe in there? And then I've got some, you know, I should have started passing this around, but these are Dewey spoons that have the ship on the spoon and Dewey on the top of the spoon. Which again, and even up in the archive, we even had a women's sewing pin kit with Dewey's face on it. Like, I don't understand what makes Dewey's face in sewing work. But again, you're talking about marketing. It's Star Wars. I mean, put Star Wars on everything, you know, on sewing kits. I guarantee you. There's an even kit out there with RTV2. But what my project is basically saying is that what people bought really kind of reflected public opinion. And so here's a good example of 2 different Dewey clocks. The one over there on the left is one that was either manufactured for one person special, or it was manufactured, but it certainly shows craftsmanship. You've got etched glass, you've got the wood detail there. That was something that someone from a specific socioeconomic class bought and displayed it in their house. Okay, you're buying a clock with a war on it. Over here is something that somebody made out of a spice rack. They took newspaper print, put some found materials. We opened up the back and you can kind of see they use shelf paper. They use bronze clock hands and some other kind of a rickety clock, which basically was saying that someone of a much lower economic status wanted a Dewey clock and they built one for themselves. They had about 3 or 4 of these things, kind of showing that people wanted this stuff. They really, really not only wanted it, gravitated toward it, but displayed it in their houses as well. I don't think I'm gonna get through, how much time do we have left?
Couple minutes then we ask you, then I'll later on do questions.
Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the welcome home for Dewey, because this is when Dewey mania kind of comes to a crescendo. He spends a year in the Philippines kind of overseeing, like a figurehead, sort of overseeing the Philippine insurrection. And the only reason he's there is because people love him so much that a lot of the bad news that's coming out of the Philippines is kind of deflected by the fact that Dewey is there. Dewey's also very savvy with the press. He had invited all these press corps guys on there, and they ended up writing words like glorious and comparing him to Washington. So he's got his hand on the media and how to kind of manipulate them. He leaves the Philippines and comes to New York. Kind of a long story that I can skip, but why he ends up in New York instead of San Francisco. But powers that be want him in New York, Boston, and Washington to welcome him back with the full force of the American people. So the spectacle, the New York parade is a spectacle. 2 million people in attendance, 16 naval ships down the Hudson River. If you guys have ever been to New York and seen the Hudson, even one ship down the Hudson is pretty impressive. This was 16 naval vessels, 35,000 sailors and soldiers, accompanying marching bands, and in Boston about a week and a half later they did the same exact thing. McKinley presented Dewey with another kind of wonderful consumer culture item, a $10,000 at the time, $10,000 22-karat sword made by Tiffany and Company. Don't have a picture, I just couldn't find a good one, but if you guys ever want to see it, it's up in New York and Washington. So this is an artist rendition of the Naval Parade at the Hudson. And I put this in there as well because this was a published poster made by the Chicago Tribune Publishing Company that they sold many, many copies of. This is the actual Olympia herself back in 1899 on the Hudson. And sorry about the blur there, the ghosts on the bottom right-hand corner, but this is the Dewey Day Parade. And it's hard to tell, but this, and you can tell by his hairline and his glasses, is Governor Theodore Roosevelt who happens to be leading the Dewey Day Parade. What a coincidence, how could that happen? It couldn't be that this was 10 years in the making. Okay, so this is the Dewey Arch. This is a 110-foot tall arch that was right over 5th Avenue in New York. So you're looking down that street right there. You're looking northbound 5th Avenue. If the camera panned out wider, this over here, that way is Broadway, and actually where the camera is stationed is the Flatiron Building. It's kind of a famous triangular building in New York. So this arch was there so that the people down, and it was very intentional by the architects, all the affluent shop goers down 5th Avenue come out of their shops and look down 5th, they see that. All the people coming out of the Broadway shows from Broadway, all those all affluent people, that's what they're seeing. It's bathed in spotlights. So you can certainly see it from everywhere. It basically ends up being only built out of something called staff. And staff is it's a temporary building product that they used to build some of the World Expo buildings. And so the intention was to build this super elaborate statue and impress everyone, and then over the next year or two, they would get public support to actually build the arch. They do that in Washington, or in New York, the Washington Arch. There's an arch in New York very similar to this called the Washington Arch. But by 1900, by the time that Dewey's kind of tour leaves the big cities and goes and his image is starting to kind of fizzle out in 1900, the public support for this completely goes away. And one of the reasons why is that things in the Philippines and the discourse on empire started to change. And so at this point, people are starting to question whether or not the Philippines was a good idea or not. Dewey's image is no longer as prevalent on newspapers now. The whole Dewey tour is over, and now you're starting to see the newspapers run stories about the Philippine insurrection, the Philippine occupation, which basically becomes a very bad situation until about 1909. And I actually put something down here from a famous history guy I was talking about, really anti-imperialist Sumner. Expansionism and imperialism are nothing but the old philosophies of national prosperity which have brought Spain to where it is today. So he's warning about American empire. And there was some magazines and stuff that actually weren't pressing war. These are a couple of them. Here are a couple of anti-establishment kind of magazines. Judge and Puck magazine, Judges in the US, Puck was in the UK. And as you can see here, they're parodying American empire here. You got little fat Uncle Sammy over there with his toy ships, stepping on the Spanish emperor right there, and all the rest of the imperial, European imperialists are all worried. And then you've got Columbia here, so the symbol of manifest destiny, and her beautiful new bonnet that says world power on it. Of course, it looks just like a ship. But you can see that there are people out there that are concerned about American empire. So just a few things, then we'll get to questions. So the legacy of naval evolution. So Dewey ends up becoming, even though he's supposed to be very influential for being the symbol of the American Navy, he actually becomes more prevalent as a member and founding member of the General Board, which actually does kind of improve the Navy from here on out. And I tell you what, I think that I can kind of skip through this because it's all kind of review. So I did want to bring up one thing. So after all of the mania and after everything, I come across this play, and it's an off Broadway play at the Manhattan Rep Theater, which is actually a fictitious, kind of in the Few Good Men realm of court-martial of Abel Montello. This is the guy that Dewey defeated at Manila Bay. And so this is an actual play. They're trying to get on Broadway, so it just kind of proved that Dewey, maybe to a certain extent, the narrative about Dewey, the masculine man, and his relationship with the Philippines kind of still lives on. So that's it, guys. Spoon still going around? Keep it going around. Questions?